Good morning to everybody. Well, good morning from me. Good afternoon to the majority, I guess, and good evening to one or two, and especially to Mark in the States. So I'm Tim Pilch. I'm Issara's consultant on global supply chains. I'm based in London, and I have great pleasure in facilitating today's webinar. It's presented by the Issara Academy, and we're going to be discussing operationalizing ethical recruitment and providing Issara's insight on first mile risks. Please do note that this is part of a series of webinars for which you can get advanced notice and early registration by visiting issarainstitute.org and selecting our programs and then Issara Academy. We really would appreciate questions from participants throughout. We found that the most efficient way of managing Q&A is to use the chat box, the Zoom group chat. Please text me, the host, your question, or just let me know you have a question to ask in person, and we can then get the presenters to answer at a convenient time. Now I would like to, one more thing to add. There's also a video, a short video on ethical recruitment that if you haven't seen the video, seen the link in our invitation, if you've joined via the website, please email me and I will send you the link. I'll give you my email address at the end of the webinar. So now I'd just like to hand you over to Mark Taylor, Issara's Director of Strategy and Global Partnering, who will be co-presenting today alongside Chor, Issara's Myanmar Country Director. I believe we also have some team members from Bangkok joining to help with technical inputs, and they will introduce themselves as they join the conversation. So over to you, Mark and Chor.
Great, thank you very much, Tim, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar on operationalizing ethical recruitment and insights on first mile risks. So over the next hour, basically we're going to, for the agenda, go over a couple very brief slides just on who Issara is, in case any of you are new to our organization. Then briefly discuss a little bit about ethical recruitment and why it's important. The fact that you're here joining us on this webinar, I think also highlights the fact that interest already in this area. But then we'll really get to the core of the presentation. And that's when we'll go into basically the different views of key stakeholders around first mile recruitment to really get some of that first, some of that insights and perspectives. And this will come from first job seekers. We'll touch upon recruitment agency views, employers, and then as well as buyers, so those brands and retailers. And then also Chacha will be taking the lead on just an update on what's happening through these recruitment corridors, and impact on first mile with the lens of what's happening with COVID-19. So something that's obviously at the forefront of all of our minds. And then we'll conclude with basically leading to solutions and emerging good practices, and perhaps share a little bit about some of the initiatives that Issara is taking specifically if there's time permits. So with that, just very briefly a little bit about Issara. So we're a nonprofit organization. We're founded in 2014, so still fairly young. And really we're focusing on transforming the lives of workers in supply chains, really utilizing worker voice, partnership, and innovation, whether that's technology or data, both high tech and low tech, to amplify those voices and provide greater visibility and transparency about workplace conditions. For our own focus as well, we're really leveraging our backgrounds in labor. So we're not focusing on environmental within the social space, very much labor focused. We have some very interesting, I think, tech tools that we use to help bring forward the work that we're doing. Team members themselves make up many of the same nationalities of the foreign migrant workers that we're supporting. And really using, I think, that background to help educate and empower job seekers and workers in the space for worker voice. increase the visibility of labor and social risks throughout the entire supply chain. And for the topic today, very much ethical recruitment and responsible recruitment is a big component of this. And not just really looking at it through the worker lens, but how can we basically take that information to both help suppliers and recruiters, as well as brands and retailers, to strengthen systems and supply chains throughout the process. So our offices, and primarily this is just a graph here of sort of Southeast Asia, just to very briefly mention where we're focusing on. You know, we have joined with this here are both Thailand and Myanmar offices. Our work focuses in Southeast Asia within the ASEAN region, although we do have team members, including myself, that are based in North America, also in Europe, and other different locations. They're providing technical support. And very lastly, just a little bit about how our team is structured, because this directly, I think, also impacts the discussion today, is that basically we sort of break ourselves out into 4 different groups and teams. The first is outreach and empowerment. And that's really linking our own operations, you know, to the populations that we're trying to empower. So those are job seekers and workers themselves. And it's our outreach and empowerment teams that are directly interfacing, you know, with workers on a daily basis. You know, this is through the 8,000 plus calls on a monthly basis, calls and messages that we're getting from workers to really better understand their own perspectives and situations and different changing patterns and trends. Then we have our business and human rights team, and that's providing the ongoing assistance to suppliers, to recruitment agencies and industries. So in Thailand, our team members are directly liaising, you know, with those different businesses. And in Myanmar, primarily our team is working directly with those recruitment agencies at source side, and then providing support as well, both to Malaysia and Cambodia, for source and destination as well. The third part of our structure is centered around the strategy and global partnerships. This is our direct work that we're doing, supporting those participating brands and retailers and importers who are looking to strengthen their own supply chains, their codes of conduct, and really try to help advance the space, and especially focusing on responsible recruitment practices, which we're talking about today. And then lastly, our tech and innovation teams that are developing a number of different tools and different ways to further advance and expand our reach and impact, whether through that more high tech, through some of the apps that we have, such as Golden Dreams, or through lower tech, through different ways that we can improve our own outreach and collaboration through different organizations that we're working with. So with that, I think we can jump right in to ethical recruitment. When we talk about ethical recruitment, obviously there's a lot of focus centering on the discussion about fees, and that absolutely makes sense. But what we see here as we sort of take a broader perspective around key principles that comprise of ethical recruitment. Many of these may not be new to you. You probably recognize some here from the DACA principles, but these have been elaborated upon a little bit. You'll notice number 7, the inclusion of credible grievance mechanisms, which we feel are really important. But I wanted to spend just a couple minutes going through these different 7 points with you, because I think a lot of the time, as noted, the fees and costs are really sort of what take up, I think, a lot of the focus in the conversation. So for first, when we talk about legal compliance and respecting all relevant laws, I think it's really important to highlight here, we're not only talking about legal compliance at destination, at the employer's location, but we're also talking about those laws from the sending countries as well. And from that source country, often there may be additionally an MOU arrangement, as we see through the corridors between Myanmar and Thailand, and also in other countries as well. And so it's really important that legal compliance is respecting all those relevant laws, in addition to, of course, you know, within each of the different supply chains, those codes of conduct that also have an impact. Secondly, when we look at ethical and professional conduct towards workers and each other, really wanting to emphasize here, it's not just legal, but it's the ethical treatment of the different parties, to make sure that there's dignity and respect being brought into the discussion and the practice. 3, free of charges of services to job seekers and workers. And this is where we get into a little bit about, are we calling this ethical recruitment? Are we calling this, employer pays principle? Or is it more just responsible recruitment where maybe workers are bearing some costs, but it's certainly, perhaps a reduced cost than what the legal amount may be. Either way you go ahead and define it, really what we're trying to focus here is that there is just transparency. It's very clear about what those different fees are. For Issara, when we talk about ethical recruitment, we're referring to basically to largely the employer pays principle, such that workers are not having to pay any fees, with the exception, and this is where there's some differing views, but for us, we view that a personal identity document like a passport is something that makes sense that a worker would pay for. Others say, it should just be 100% no fees to workers, but in any case, the majority or most all costs are therefore borne by the employer. Number 4, we're talking about transparent and ethical terms of engagement. Transparency is a very big issue, and so here we're really getting at what the terms and the expectations are, and this really also leads to greater accountability. Number 5, transparent wages, deductions, and benefits. And so this is not only for that pair between the employer and the recruitment agency, but it's also that it's also for workers themselves, as well as of course buyers who are looking to make sure that their own requirements are being carried out throughout the supply chain. Number 6, healthy, safe, exploitation-free working and living conditions. So obviously recruitment is very much focusing on, it's not just on that recruitment process, but there's direct ties and links to what is actually taking place when the worker arrives, at that factory or processing facility or the employer's location. It's those working conditions as well as the living conditions that worker has, and make sure that that is matching up to what the terms of and the conditions of the MOU agreement or the contract that the worker signed. And so this is also something where it's really important that we're looking at the broader picture and not just focusing on fees, but to making sure that there has been transparent and clear information about the nature of the work itself. And lastly, number 7, access to remedy and functional, credible grievance mechanisms. This part here is something that is very prominent to Issara's own work through our different worker voice channels, and something that we draw upon. But it's not only about sort of third-party independent grievance mechanisms such as Issara's. We're also talking about here, from a longer-term perspective, how can we build up and make sure that both the employer's grievance mechanisms are sound, as well as the recruitment agencies as well too. And these are different areas, as duty bearers, we really hope that we want to really help strengthen through the process. So why is ethical recruitment important? Number of different reasons, but here we've noted some that we really wanted to highlight at the onset of this presentation. The first is that the recruitment practices are often non-transparent and a source of high risk. We also see that the existing practices need to evolve. It's something that the traditional audit compliance approaches really don't work well, we've found, for recruitment. It's very difficult to go ahead and address issues through a lot of times, by auditing different documents and paperwork and other different ways, when one of the number one issues that we hear from job seekers themselves and workers about why they leave their job with their employer is often because of deception or misinformation that was presented at the time when they basically signed up for the job opportunity. And these are kind of things that audits just would be very difficult to pick up in themselves. And what you really do need is a trusted worker voice to bring these issues to light. Number three, we're also seeing that both employers, the suppliers, as well as the recruitment agencies themselves, are often not as familiar as one might expect with regard to, the legal requirements, as well as those higher bar ethical obligations that we're all very much interested in seeing have greater adoption and presence within across the corridors that we're looking at. Number four, from a worker perspective, certainly we see that ethical recruitment is critical because indebtedness and vulnerability often start or definitely can be exacerbated from the recruitment process, and these can lead to even more serious labor abuses in the workplace. And also we're seeing direct ties in many occasions with document retention, with overwork and pressure, as well as wage theft, all stemming through what's happening or what has happened because of indebtedness and those vulnerabilities. Number five, we're also seeing for ethical recruitment that it's becoming, I wouldn't say mainstream, it may not be quite there, but we're seeing definitely a stronger movement and appreciation of how important it is when business is trying to develop more ethical supply chains and carry out their own, business ethos and responsible business practices. So certainly there's been getting a lot more attention, as it certainly should. And then lastly, not only are there just some real, risk areas that have been identified and areas for strengthening, but there's opportunity to really address these. And these can have huge benefits and transformation potential, not only within corridors, but across different industries as well. So there's a lot more we could discuss, but certainly these are some of the areas that we really wanted to highlight about why we were focusing on ethical recruitment. So what are we hearing from some of the stakeholders? And wanted just to take a moment here to share a couple quotes, one from a Thai employer, another from a Malaysian supplier, as well as a Myanmar recruitment agency, because I think these capture, a lot of sentiment that we're hearing across these different groups. So first from the Thai employer, who says, "I have no control over the matters that are taking place in Myanmar. I should not have to pay for illegal costs that workers have paid to a broker. How can one even know that this information or what workers tell me is really the true cost?" So certainly from our own work, we hear these sort of views, this sort of sense of, everything is kind of opaque, what's happening in a foreign country where there's different languages. But at the same time, I think that kind of attitude review is missing some of the key areas around, different opportunities there are to actually reduce, I think that black box and opaqueness. And a lot of this can come through the management services agreement that employers have with recruitment agencies, through worker voice channels and other different ways. But certainly that's a very common response we're hearing a lot from employers. Additionally, from Malaysian supplier, who says, "We have a zero fees recruitment policy, and we're willing to pay the necessary recruitment costs and margins that the Myanmar recruitment agency is asking." So it's actually quite frustrating that when we interview workers after they arrive at our facility and ask if they've paid fees, that they say yes, that they have paid fees. And we just want the recruitment agency to be transparent so we can work on the solution together. So there's been, increasing number, I would say, of Malaysian businesses that are looking to source from Myanmar. This in part had to do with some of the temporary challenges that were taking place from Nepal, for looking for other sources of workers. And this view and this, I think, sense of frustration is really stemming from, that there's a willingness and ability to pay and wanting to carry out, I think, the right steps. But in reality, something is broken. Something is just not flowing, further upstream. And we'll talk more about why this is. Well, the will is there, but they're not actually able to, or having some real challenges carrying that out. And then lastly, from a Myanmar recruitment agency's perspective, the quote, When interviewing job seekers in Yangon, it can be very difficult to determine if they have paid money to a broker or a third party. They're getting coached about what to say and what not to say. And this is very true. We hear this from a large number of recruitment agencies, and it gets validated from workers. We've shared different videos from workers themselves attesting to, to this kind of situation. And a lot of this stems from workers just not wanting to jeopardize a job opportunity for employment, but it gets I think amplified significantly when there's been recruitment fees paid, especially when there's been illegally high recruitment fees paid and indebtedness involved. And so this is a big part of some of the behavior change that we're looking to take on to try to help bring more transparency, I think, into the fee structures, but also, just around what no fees for workers actually means in reality. So through this whole process, the way that Issara is really looking at this is taking an evidence-driven system change approach. So we talk about evidence-driven really here, the kind of underscored by worker voice that can really tell you about the realities of how the system is really working for workers and for those actors within. And a systems change approach is that we're trying to actually get down to the root causes of the current practices, why they're happening, what is the decision making that's leading to this, and then to try to identify possible intervention points for the behavior change and the change that we're seeking. So this involves looking at it from different perspectives to really understanding how we can bring about desired change. And so it's looking at it from the perspective of the worker or the job seeker who's at the center, looking at it from the employer's perspectives, the recruitment agency's perspectives, and then brands and retailers as well. And that's what we'll be doing in this next section, sort of breaking it out, from that insight and from those views of these key stakeholders. So let's start first with a little bit from a job seeker's perspective and what they're experiencing at the first mile. So I think the first thing that everyone should be cognizant of, to be aware of, is that even if employers or recruitment agencies are presenting opportunities where their workers should not have to pay any fees for desired employment, job seekers generally are willing to pay. They're willing to pay for those employment opportunities, and we have to keep in mind that this has been typical sort of standard practice. So if you take Myanmar, for example, they've set limits in terms of the maximum amount in source countryside that workers should have to pay, which is 150,000 baht. And maybe destination countries as well have also set parameters or ceilings about what the maximum that workers should pay or what type of fees that they should pay for. But the reality is there's demand for it, and if it's a good opportunity, workers are willing to go ahead and pay fees. So part of this then is about knowledge, attitude, and behaviors. So employers pays principal or no fees to workers. It is a new concept. It's very different to what has been on offer to job seekers. And typically what we're seeing is, in Myanmar, for instance, for workers that are going to Thailand, oftentimes I think it's, we're seeing sort of on average that workers are paying about $700, but it can very easily go up to $800 or $1,000 for perceived good jobs and good employers. For the Myanmar to Malaysia corridors, that's increased to about $1,000 to $1,500. In part because of the $850 sort of acceptable or allowable fees, and basically, that's it's a background and context that most workers are anchored in. So if all of a sudden you're coming up and saying, "Hey, we've got this opportunity now. We've got this great employer that is saying you don't have to pay anything," and you're normally, paying anywhere between $700 to $1,500 US, there's a sense that this is actually too good to be true. Perhaps it's just a trick, or we're hearing from job seekers and workers that, perhaps that maybe this employer is having to go ahead and, resort to providing this situation because actually the work must not be very good, or there must be other reasons behind it. So, as we're looking to, introduce much better opportunities where costs are not being borne on the back of workers, and employers and recruitment agencies are paying for these, it's interesting that we're actually having to see and deal with, I think, some of the reluctance or hesitance, from job seekers themselves, in trying to change their own knowledge, attitude, and behavior on these issues. Additionally, for job seekers, information asymmetries is something that we see all the time. So basically, job seekers, they want to know who are the good employers, what are the good job opportunities. They want to know more about the nature of the work. But what also is missing, in addition to just specifics around the job itself, is that what their own rights are. And the more information that they have and they're armed with, it also means that they have more options, and then they can make better and more informed decisions. So a big part of this, and the work that we're doing as well, in terms of handing out worker rights booklets based on what the laws are, not only in their own country but also in the destination country, and what questions to ask and who to contact is really important. Because it's not just about telling someone that they have rights, but it's actually how do you go ahead and how are they actually supposed to act upon that? So who can they get in touch with, and to make sure that that's upheld. Additionally, some of the other challenges that you see at first mile, it's not just the information asymmetries, but it's the actual networks itself. And so, going a little bit back to the question that was asked a minute ago about brokers, I think a common idea that many people have is that, that there's these illegal brokers and they're basically going out and exploiting job seekers and more vulnerable people looking for more economic, better opportunities for themselves and their families. And while this is certainly true, the reality is it's not just those brokers themselves. We're seeing situations where there's return workers. We're seeing that there's, village headmen, people in trusted positions. We're even seeing, there's Buddhist monks. There's all sorts of just individuals within those networks of job seekers that may have access to information, where they're many times using that, and then expecting or asking for certain fees in the process. So the notion that there's, just that one broker out there, is much more complicated. There are a lot of brokers, that are carrying out illegal practices, and these are the ones that we're trying to generally to displace through better and more transparent information. But certainly, there's more gray in this space than one might initially think. And then also we're seeing a lot of threats actually that come out, and that some of these brokers are using to try to convince workers basically to not report the fees that they have paid, even when there's more ethical recruitment opportunities. So basically they're saying that, they're telling workers and these job seekers that, if they do report having paid any fees, then basically they will lose that job opportunity and all the money that they've already paid for that recruitment opportunity, and that they'll have to go back home, or that in many cases during the interview process itself, if they're asked to go ahead and provide any information about fees that they paid, they must say no, because if they do, they may be disqualified. And then also we hear things, both at the source country as well as destination, that workers are nervous that if they say anything negative, or job seekers, that could actually jeopardize future opportunities for fellow villagers, other individuals that they may know be seeking job opportunities, because basically those recruiters will no longer return from that location. So these are all different kind of factors that that complicate, I think, addressing some of the challenges that take place at that village level, at that very first mile. And just one more point to add on this as well too, just around costs. So some of you may have seen this in some of Issara's reports when we had first done sort of a breakdown of the different fees, actual legal and ethical costs of recruitment. So on the left here is the official process, and that's broken down between what an employer has to pay and what a worker has to pay. Then we show what it would look like under ethical recruitment, and then what the reality is in the current situation. And basically not to spend too much time on this, but basically not a lot has changed. We do see more businesses and more recruitment agencies interested in providing some more opportunities that have zero cost or much lower costs. But the reality is the vast majority of workers, through the corridors that we're targeting, are still bearing the vast majority of costs.
There's quite a few questions coming in regarding costs. Firstly, there's an area that I think we might cover as we go along about invisible costs and how to convince employers they should cover invisible costs and such costs as logistics, travel, etc.
So I think the quick answer on invisible costs is, obviously this is a challenging situation because it's it's more hidden, it's buried. There's all sorts of pressures that you may see that might try to encourage that these don't surface. But I think for us, and the reason why we view worker voice-driven ethical recruitment to be so, I think, both effective and critical, is that it can bring to light a lot of these invisible costs. Now, there are certain conditions which make it a lot more readily easily to obtain that information. It's not easy, but the biggest part I would say is trust. So we need to provide an environment, a situation such that workers will feel that there will not be any direct reprisals or risks to their job opportunity or to fees, if they paid recruitment fees and so on, that they would feel comfortable to be sharing that information. So a big part of it is, have we set up a situation environment such that workers can share the true realities, of what their recruitment journey, including costs, have included. From Issara's own work, that becomes, we've found that some workers are very comfortable going ahead and sharing that if that trust is already built, especially if you've been able to have touch points from the very beginning, at source and even at that village level. Others maybe feel more comfortable to report that once they have arrived at their employer place of location. And then sometimes even it takes a little bit more time before they feel in a place to go ahead and share it. But if you have worker voice channels that are open to workers, our experience has been that you will get informants, you will get individuals that are willing to go ahead and share how that information then is handled and how that's actioned. Also has a big implication on, will other workers, word of mouth, will other workers also be willing to share? So I'd say that's one big piece of the invisible costs. The other big piece besides worker voice really comes out to more transparency around the management services agreement. So to the extent that an employer and a recruitment agency are able to very clearly map out and to articulate what all the different costs are and who should be paying for them, the less that these kind of challenges will come up. There are certain areas that are going to be harder than others, and we've seen businesses grappling with these. Sometimes it has to do around travel and recruitment costs to a job interview, and what happens when a worker doesn't pass the screening or the qualifications, who should be responsible for that. There's other areas that are a little bit more tricky, but the vast majority, I think, through good open dialogue between the recruitment agency and the employer, can address, I think, a lot of what those invisible costs are, or at least a little bit more formal, and then worker voice will hopefully make the others more transparent. So first, let's talk a moment about the source side, the origin recruitment agencies. So very briefly here, just a little bit of context to kind of put this in perspective. Both within Thailand and in Malaysia, so these are the corridors, for both those destination countries, sourcing from Myanmar as well as Cambodia. Basically, we're seeing the use of recruitment agencies in the destination country. So a Thailand employer using a Thailand recruitment agency to interface directly with the Myanmar recruitment agency, or a Malaysian employer using a Malaysian recruitment agency to interface directly, with a Myanmar recruitment agency or Cambodian recruitment agency, and so on. So when that happens, in many occasions, not all, but in many occasions, we see then that national recruitment agency often becomes almost a gatekeeper. And so that the source side recruitment agency, say from Myanmar, which all employers have to go through, they often don't have visibility then. Both sides don't have visibility. And so that lack of transparency can lead to a number of different risks. And also we see that leading to, not a lot of informal fees, because that agency is trying to basically to see, who they can get the best offering from, including T-money, under the table payments, and so on. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, because we're not seeing that direct employer to source side recruitment agency mix. That's not to say that those national, either Thailand or Malaysian recruitment agencies are not providing any services, but in many cases, the employer is not asking those questions or doesn't have the transparency about really what is transpiring between those two actors. So the challenge that Myanmar recruitment agencies are sort of facing in this arrangement, a big part of it when we talk about first mile fees and even employers that are willing to address risk around first mile fees, is that they don't have enough customers that are really addressing this. The employer pays principals, no fees for workers, and so on. There's just not enough employers, their customers, who basically are willing to pay a little bit more to have that validation and to have better practices. So they're stuck with a dual model, one where they've got some of their customers that are, a smaller percentage that are willing to pay, and then the majority that are, they're just looking for a cheap price, and that's it. And so it's hard for a recruitment agency to balance that. Next, you see situations around the investment that actually takes a recruitment agency to professionalize and to hire their own internal agents or staff to be working directly to ensuring the standards and the quality of information that's being provided to job seekers. So some recruitment agencies are investing in it, but it does take more resources, more costs. And so that is a challenge as well too, if your customers are not necessarily always willing to go ahead and pay for it, or just a small percentage are. We see other challenges around the lead times that it takes. So some of these are sort of more of the structural issues between country governments and the arrangements where lead times are too short to find high volumes of workers. And that also is directly linked to a lot of recruitment agencies. They're not warehousing workers, they're going out to try to find workers. And so they're relying on brokers quite heavily if they don't have their own internal agents. And so therefore, these brokers may not even know they know that they've got job seekers that are looking for employment opportunities, but they ultimately may not know, which job opportunities may come up that they're trying to place those workers into. So that's a bit of a challenge. You see some more progressive recruitment agencies, using Facebook and other channels to advertise for job opportunities to those job seekers, at that village level. But then you see brokers getting wise and basically taking that same information, because it's out there in the public domain, and basically using that to try to recruit additional workers. And then also sometimes, the brokers are actually providing services that job seekers need that the recruitment agencies are just not fulfilling. So go back to that very first question, some of the reasons why that, the brokers are actually providing a needed service. And so that makes it a bit more challenging. And all this together from recruitment agencies, and one of sort of the kind of jumping ahead a little bit on some of the solutions, is that we're seeing better job announcements and more details to help better inform job seekers. But we're also seeing collaborations. And so there's a CSOnet, a network of over 25 civil society organizations, that Issara is working very closely with to try to displace those illegal brokers and to empower workers to make sure that they know how to, contact the recruitment agencies directly to validate real jobs, and so on. So, this is some of the activities that's taking place from recruitment agencies. And then if we compare that also for our employers, some similar concerns, but a bit different. So cost concerns are front and center, obviously, and this is a big friction point that most suppliers have. So many employers are actually, and this is, I would say, more so in Thailand than in Malaysia, but many employers are currently not paying any fees at all to either Thailand or Myanmar agents for their recruitment services. So obviously, if an employer is not paying for it, recruitment agency is not doing it of just their own, goodwill, and so it's obviously coming off of the back of workers. Another piece around the cost issue is suppliers want to make sure that there's a level playing field. So they just don't want to, they may be more open to it, but they want to make sure that their competitors, are also having to pay the same thing, and the same standards are being applied by their buyers to other businesses. So I think this is an area that, we've seen it hasn't been applied evenly, I think, in some cases from buyers, and that's a big concern, obviously, for employers. Employers also have some doubts. Many times these are unsubstantiated, just beliefs, false ideas about what really happens if they were to go ahead and pay for employer pays models. And I think the two areas that we see most common in this is one, that if they pay all the fees up front, then workers aren't going to go ahead and stay at their business. They'll take the next best opportunity they can that provides more overtime. And so, why should they bear all the costs? The reality is that that's not why workers leave. We've done different surveys. We're speaking to, tens of thousands of workers. The reason why workers leave are for other. I mean, certainly the amount of overtime does get factored in, but if that was the reason a worker had left, it's typically because they were promised during the recruitment time process that they would be getting much more than in reality that they had. So they're just not jumping to other job opportunities as perceived better opportunities come up. Then also there's a perception that, if they use Thai agents, that their own responsibilities as an employer diminishes, that they can actually shift that responsibility to that Thai agent or that Malaysian agent. And so that's also something that, that awareness raising is that the employers, there is shared responsibility in this process. We also see, from employers' perspective, just, around lack of visibility, that they don't have a lot of contact with the recruitment agencies on the origin side, or they don't have any service agreements, or if they do, it's pretty superficial and doesn't really get into the necessary details. So obviously that's going to be a challenge if you're trying to address first mile risk. And then also, if they don't have worker voice, or perhaps they're getting false positives. So we do see employers that, once workers arrive, they, in good earnest, they want to go ahead and find out, hey, did workers pay any fees or any fees that they were not supposed to? The challenge here, again, is that trust issue. And many times workers, especially new workers that have come to the channel, they're very reluctant to say anything negative about their recruitment journey, just in fear that actually there could be negative ramifications from that. And that's also sort of commentary, I think, that comes about through grievance mechanisms to some extent as well. And then lastly, from a lack of systems change, I think, as employers are gradually becoming more aware of ethical recruitment, and the focus is often on cost, but not so much around the systems change. So this is an area that we really want to be focusing more on, because in many cases, there can be significant improvements and reduction in risk that really doesn't require much capital. The financial investment is quite small. It's more around kind of policies and practices. So we want to go ahead and make sure that there's, a clear roadmap to get them on more of an ethical recruitment track, which does include addressing costs, but as we showed earlier, those 7 principles, there's a lot of other areas that can really improve and reduce risks on the recruitment that are not fees related. And then lastly, in this section, we want to talk just for a few minutes about some of the experiences we hear from brands and retailers as well at the first mile. And certainly, there's a growing awareness of labor risk at first mile, from illegal brokers to indebtedness that can lead to, in menace of penalty, vulnerabilities, just a number of workplace abuses. We've seen, whether it's the Consumer Goods Forum or, FLA or, Responsible Business or RBA, there's a number of sort of membership bodies, organizations that are really driving change, I think, or at least getting on the radar amongst their membership, how important it is to be addressing recruitment. And then is that being carried a little bit further in terms of first mile? Well, I think that goes to the second point here around perception of limited options or solutions, or perhaps there's just, very limited easy options here. And this is that, addressing first mile risk is difficult. And, few partners, I'm guessing that they work with have, in terms of, the buyers, offices, team members, initiatives that are operating both at source and destination, which is really important. And then even if you are, do you have arrangements in place to go ahead and be operating at that village level, which is difficult. And then similarly as well, there's still a very strong reliance on supplier provided information or audit data, and basically a view, a comfort level of working within the supply chain. And so what that often means is, it's more challenging, I think, to ensure worker safeguards, to be able to hear from workers in terms of the validation of what's actually taken place, or around remediation processes having to do with first mile risks, are often missing and can be quite difficult to actually carry out. So I think we're seeing some challenges there, from buyers, even though there may be an awareness, but I think just the practicalities of implementation can be challenging. And then similarly as well, just in terms of communications, we are seeing, while there's greater interest and kind of traction directionally that we'd like to see, then in many cases that, there's policies are created, but it's still very early times, and there's a lot of questions internally that buyers have about actually how to operationalize that. Are they picking particular corridors or particular industries to look at? In terms of timeframes for suppliers, what is appropriate? Does it start as of this date, as of now, or are they allowing, I think it was the Consumer Goods Forum, a couple years back was looking at a 5 to 7 year time horizon, and you hear that from other businesses as well, that it's not immediate, but it's coming up on the horizon, so there's a signal. But the reality is, most of the suppliers aren't actually going to be changing their practices too much unless it's a bit more immediate. I think it also comes to the signaling and the nature of the relationship that they have, with their suppliers. A bigger part of this is also just around, I think, positive reinforcement and signaling. Many times we're hearing, basically buyers saying this is a requirement of us, whether it's coming because of a migrant worker policy that's just being implemented, or, a stronger enforcement of, existing supplier codes of conduct. The reality is we're not seeing as much sort of encouragement or incentive being provided for suppliers to change. So that question that was asked earlier a little bit about, with cost, I think this is a big part of that dialogue that, an area that really needs to be worked on a little bit more, is around not just the sticks, but the carrots that can come around to try to get that behavior change from suppliers. And then very lastly, obviously, it'd be great if you can have, if you're a retailer or, a business that's operating globally, you can have those common standards and practices and solutions applied across your supply chains. The reality, I think what we're really seeing when it comes to, the challenge of first mile is that it's quite difficult, and you really need on the ground, trusted partners, whichever, typically NGOs, but there can be other different bodies, or where it's available, stronger unions and so on. But basically, that kind of understand, what's happening around potential for reprisals or retaliation, and what the situation for workers are. And that often means you're not going to have one broader solution that can be applied everywhere. You're going to have to be a bit more localized, I think, and at least regional, I think, in terms of what some of these solutions look like. So that kind of concludes, I think, from some of the different perspectives. I'm just noting as well, we're getting a bit close on time. So I think I wanted to maybe ask Cha-Cha, because obviously what comes up a lot is, given that context and what we're seeing, what's it like now? I mean, what is happening with COVID-19? So Cha-Cha, since you're there in Myanmar as our country director, would you mind sharing a little bit and kind of walking through, noting the time as well, but kind of hitting on some of the key points on what's happening with COVID?
Yes, sure, Mark. Hello, everyone. Yes, we have heard and talked about the situation and challenges faced by different actors. And then it's already a difficult and challenging things. But with COVID, things are getting more challenging and complicated. Borders are still closed mostly, and flights still are not operating. So we have many job seekers waiting and keep asking when they can go, when the border will be reopened, when the flights will be resumed so that they can start and go and work. But we know that all this recruitment process has been suspended. And then it causing debt with high interest rate. And some job seekers have paid their recruitment fees, not only the legally allowable fees, but a huge amount of what we have mentioned about invisible costs as well, since January, February. And then so they are already in 6 to 7 months in debt, and with a very high interest rate, as in most cases as high as 20% a month. So some job seekers already kind of thinking that, okay, I do not want to go because I do not know how long will it take me to go. So I bet I want to pay off my debt. So some of them even kind of asking, we also received some phone calls and kind of inquiries that they would like to change the decision to not migrate, and they would like to know whether they can get their recruitment fees and costs. And of course, when we talk to our recruitment agencies federation, our colleagues from working for the recruitment agencies, and some said we are paying back the illegal allowable fees, but we are not going to pay back other fees. And some recruitment agency would say that, okay, it's the decision of the job seekers, but we still have the job available for them. So we are not going to pay back any fees to them because we have already provided the service that we should be providing under our service fees. And in some of them, they said that we already paid for your airfare, and so we are not going to give you these fees back. But the visibility of all these fees, that how much, paying for what, and whether these are actually being paid or not, it's a big question that many of the recruitment agency are not providing or not getting any kind of pressure to provide these. And then so job seekers are having difficulties. And many times job seekers are paying all this amount in a lump sum. And so they do not know the cost breakdown. So they will, if they are desperate, they will accept whatever cost that they are being given back by the recruitment agency, or some may know where to launch the complaint, so that with the help of the different organizations like CTUM, the trade union, or different CSOs, they may be able to get their fees back. But not many of them. And the other thing is that they do not have, many times they pay the cost not directly to the recruitment agencies, but to the middlemen, the brokers. So the recruitment agency can still say that, okay, I do not know, you pay the brokers. So the rest of the money are being taken by the brokers, so I'm not going to deal with this. And so the brokers also may run away or may avoid paying that. And that lead to the second, the following point on national policies and regulation, accountability at the government level. Who is going to take the actions against all these brokers? According to Myanmar law, if you're offering and facilitating job seekers to go abroad, you are violating the law. But we know that many brokers are operating, but if these job seekers launch complaints against broker, we're still having issues of who's going to take. Is it under the Overseas Employment Act, or is it under Human Trafficking Act, or what's the role of the station police or anti-trafficking police or Ministry of Labor? So things are very unclear. And of course, there will be expiration of calling, demand approval, the visa process. The recruitment agencies and the job seekers do not know what will happen if these visas are being canceled, like expired, and if the calling are being canceled and they cannot go anymore, work anymore. So, but giving all these complexity and uncertainty of the rules and regulations and policy, but all this responsibility are put onto job seekers and workers. You said go and launch the complaints, but there is no regulations, who is going to responsible for what, and on the other hand, we are not talking about hundreds of people. We are talking about thousands of people who may lodge the complaints when jobs are being canceled, or when workers do not want to go. So what's the capacity of the recruitment agency complaint mechanism or grievance mechanism? What's the mechanism with the government? Are we all ready? So these are a huge questions, big questions. But it's really kind of many job seekers feel helpless as well. And at the same time, recruitment agencies are also kind of facing with all these difficult uncertainties and how to address all these things. So things are more complicated and more challenging. But I think, we hope that we will conclude this section with some of the promising kind of solutions. So I will hand this over back to Mark.
So thanks, Chacha, for that update on the current status on what's happening. So it's sort of basically in summary, in terms of what, for those that are interested in really sort of tackling first mile and debt and kind of some of the different ways to go forward, a few things we want to highlight. The first is that we need to be engaging and really working on solutions for job seekers. So that very much is that first mile, and that needs to be linked with both source and destination sides. So I think those areas, those two components are really critical. Additionally, if you are going to be working at that first mile, at that village level, it's going to be probably transaction costs are going to be high. You need to really, I think, for us, we found the best way to address that is through networks. So we have that through the CSO network. There's also worker ambassadors as well. Different ways that you can basically get that coverage that you need, and those partnerships and collaboration. Transaction costs otherwise will just be really high for, I think, any organization to be able to do that. Awareness raising and empowerment of job seekers is certainly improving, and we're seeing, more and more uptake, I think, on improved recruitment practices and even no fees for workers. And a big part of this is not picking winners in terms of individual pairs of recruitment agencies, employers, but I think really, how can we go ahead and crowd in more good agencies and employers and really raise the bar, I think, rather than, what we see sometimes, although it helps, but for real longer term change, we need to be, improving the systems itself more and be working with it more key actors. I think and this is both for Myanmar recruitment agencies, Cambodia recruitment agencies, more broadly, there's a real focus on reduction of reliance on informal brokers, but that also means professionalization and investment. The need for an ethical recruitment marketplace certainly is there. This is an area that actually Issara has a new initiative coming up with Golden Dreams 2.0, which will really be focusing on this, so bringing in not just for workers, but for employers and recruitment agencies, as well as enforcement of laws. I mean, you're not going to be able to really level the playing field if there isn't basically enforcement of what's already on the books. I'll skip down here to employers. A real need to be a bit more proactive, quite frankly. So demanding more accountability and transparency, as the customer in these relationships, with recruitment agencies. Ultimately, it's the employer. These are employees. They're going to be, part of working for their business. There needs to be a bit more, I think, in terms of, ensuring that the desired practices are being upheld, that there are reasonable and fair costs involved. And obviously just an understanding, if the employer is not paying for these fees, it's going to be the workers. They're going to end up paying for it. Source side recruitment fees, we're also seeing, source side recruitment agencies are actively providing remedy. So we're seeing more and more examples of this. That's in part because of enforcement, but also better service agreements and better relationships. And so, I think that's a very promising sign as well, that there is willingness to remedy, I think, those those incorrect practices. Global buyers are certainly signaling and improving, I think, the need for these improvements. And certainly, I think the uptake, potential is there. And there's an ability to really disrupt the market and drive change. I mean, this is all doable, including at that first mile area, but a lot of it is about making sure that the right questions are being asked and the right collaborations are being forged to help make this come to reality. And then very lastly, just to throw in a little bit of plug for our own worker, just to share kind of what we're doing in this space. It really centers around 3 different areas. So one is we have a worker voice driven ethical recruitment program that's focusing more, I think, on the tools and the different steps. We're just reinvigorating this right now in terms of really providing, I think, more means and pathways for employers and recruitment agencies to strengthen their practices. Through the collaboration of CSONet. So that started off with Walmart Foundation support, and it's been advancing with other donor and other initiatives that's really helping, I think, that with that empowerment piece and the collaborations we're seeing between this network of CSOs and the recruitment agencies themselves, which is a real turning point. In addition to behavior change from job seekers themselves and their willingness and comfort level to ask questions about the nature of the job opportunities and going directly to recruitment agencies. So that's really showing, the opportunity for change. And then also a Golden Dreams 2.0 recruitment marketplace, as I mentioned, as well, to bring together, both job seekers, employers, and recruitment agencies, building off of the existing platform that was already developed. So I think with that, we will conclude, and want to thank you all for spending a few extra minutes, and sorry for running long, and hope this was helpful and informative.